The pounding on my door at 3 minutes past 6 in the morning didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a decision. Through the peephole, I saw a deputy sheriff, but the real threat was across the street. My parents were standing by the mailbox, watching like spectators. The deputy held an order saying I had to be out by noon, yet I had never missed a single payment on the home I legally owned. My name is Kylie Perez, and the day my life fractured into two distinct pieces began not with a scream, but with a heavy rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the floorboards of the master bedroom. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet sanctuary of a suburban morning. It was the sound of metal striking wood, a hollow and authoritative pounding that bypassed the ears and rattled the very bones of the house. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The lingering fog of sleep instantly burned away by a spike of pure, primal adrenaline. The air in the room was stale and cold, the kind of stillness that settles over a house just before the sun breaks the horizon. I sat up, clutching the duvet to my chest, my breath catching in a throat that felt suddenly dry and tight. From the front of the house, the voice boomed, muffled by the layers of drywall and insulation, but unmistakable in its intent. "Sheriff's office. Open up!" The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. My first instinct was denial. This had to be a mistake, a wrong address, a nightmare that I had not yet woken up from. I turned my head to the digital clock on the nightstand. The red numbers glowed in the semi-darkness, mocking me with their precision. It was 3 minutes past 6 in the morning. 6 in the morning. My body went cold. A sensation that started at my fingertips and raced inward, freezing my lungs. Law enforcement did not knock on doors at 3 minutes past 6 in the morning for a friendly chat. They did not come this early for a noise complaint or a neighborhood inquiry. They came at this hour when they wanted to catch you vulnerable. They came at this hour when they wanted to execute a warrant. I threw the covers off, my bare feet hitting the hardwood floor. The cold shocked me, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I grabbed the silk robe draping over the chair, my hands fumbling with the tie, my fingers stiff and uncooperative. The pounding came again, louder this time, demanding and relentless. It sounded like a decision had been made, a gavel brought down on a verdict I hadn't even heard yet. I hurried into the hallway, the familiar shadows of my home warping into something sinister. This was my house. I had bought it with my own money. Signed the mountains of paperwork. Paid the mortgage every single month without fail for 7 years. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every drafty corner, every imperfection in the paint. It was the one thing in my life that was undeniably, legally mine. The idea that the sheriff's office was banging on my front door felt like a violation of the laws of physics. I reached the foyer, the frosted glass of the front door glowing faintly with the early morning light from the street lamps outside. I didn't unlock it. Not yet. I had watched enough true crime documentaries and read enough legal thrillers to know you never open the door until you know exactly what is on the other side. I pressed my eye to the peephole, the fisheye lens distorting the world outside into a curved, surreal panorama. Standing directly on my welcome mat was a deputy. He was a wall of tan uniform, his face impassive and professional, the kind of face that delivered bad news as a matter of routine. He held a clipboard in one hand, his posture relaxed but ready, his other hand resting near his belt. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a patrol car. It sat quietly, no lights flashing, no siren wailing. It was a silent predator waiting in the gloom. But it wasn't the deputy that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't the gun on his hip or the badge gleaming on his chest. It was the movement across the street. My gaze shifted past the deputy, past the patrol car, to the sidewalk opposite my house. 2 figures stood there, framed by the gray light of dawn, standing near the neighbor's brick mailbox. They weren't passers-by. They weren't neighbors walking a dog. They were standing still, watching my front door with the terrifying patience of vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. It was Elena and Gabriel Perez, my parents. I stopped breathing. The air trapped in my lungs turned toxic. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, dressed not in pajamas or hastily thrown-on coats, but fully dressed for the day. My mother, Elena, wore her stiff navy coat, her hair perfectly coiffed, her hands clasped in front of her. My father, Gabriel, stood with his arms crossed, his posture rigid. They looked like spectators at a parade. They looked like they were watching their favorite television show, waiting for the climax they knew was coming. A wave of nausea rolled over me. They were not here to help. They were not here because they had heard the police and were worried about their daughter. They were here because they knew. They were here because they had orchestrated this. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, staggering me back a step from the door. The estrangement had been quiet for months, a cold war of silence and unanswered texts. But I never imagined it would escalate to a sheriff's deputy on my doorstep at sunrise. "Sheriff's office," the deputy called out again, his voice flat and bored. "I know you are in there. Open the door, or we will be forced to gain entry." Gain entry. The euphemism for kicking down the door I had sanded and painted myself. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the shaking in my hands. I couldn't let them see me panic. That was what they wanted. Elena and Gabriel thrived on chaos, on the emotional disintegration of everyone around them. If I opened that door crying, if I opened it screaming, they would win before the battle had even started. I tightened the belt of my robe, smoothed my hair back, and unlocked the deadbolt with a loud, deliberate click. I left the security chain engaged. The door opened 4 inches, the metal chain pulling taut, creating a barrier between my sanctuary and the threat outside. Through the gap, the morning air rushed in, smelling of damp asphalt and exhaust. The deputy looked down at me, his eyes scanning my face, comparing it to whatever photo or description he had on his clipboard. "Are you Kylie Perez?" he asked. It wasn't a question of curiosity. It was a procedural box he needed to check. "Yes," I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady, low, and devoid of the terror that was currently liquefying my insides. "I am Kylie Perez. Why are you banging on my door at this hour?" The deputy didn't blink. He shifted the clipboard, pulling a document from the metal clip. He held it up, but the text was too dense to read in the dim light. I saw the seal of the county court. I saw the thick, heavy font of legal headers. "I am here to execute a court order," he stated, his tone reciting a script he had likely spoken 1,000 times. "This is a writ of possession." The words floated in the air between us, foreign and nonsensical. Writ of possession, that was a term used for squatters, for tenants who hadn't paid rent in 6 months, for foreclosures where the bank took back a property after years of default. It was not a term used for a woman who had automatic payments set up for every utility, every tax bill, and every mortgage installment. "There is a mistake," I said, my grip on the door frame tightening until my knuckles turned white. "You have the wrong house. I own this property. I am the sole owner. There is no landlord to evict me." The deputy looked at me with a flicker of pity, the kind of condescending sympathy a sober person offers a drunk who insists they can drive. He glanced down at the paperwork again. "The address is correct, ma'am. The order is signed by a judge. It is a valid eviction order to be enforced today." He didn't say who the plaintiff was. He didn't have to. I could feel their eyes boring into me from across the street. I looked through the crack in the door, past the deputy's shoulder, and locked eyes with my mother. Elena Perez didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She smiled, a small, tight curving of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile of triumph. She took a step forward, leaving the curb and walking into the street, her voice carrying sharply in the morning silence. "You could have done this the easy way." "Kylie," she called out. Her tone was conversational, almost chipper, as if she were commenting on a choice of restaurant rather than the forced removal of her daughter from her home. "You chose to be difficult. Now you deal with the consequences." The sound of her voice triggered a memory of 1,000 similar ultimatums, 1,000 moments where her love was conditional on my absolute submission. But this was a nuclear escalation. I looked back at the deputy. He seemed uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, He didn't like the audience. He didn't like the domestic drama spilling out onto the pavement. He just wanted to do his job and go get coffee. I am not leaving, I told him, pitching my voice so my parents could hear it too. This is my house. I have the deed. I have never been served with any lawsuit. This is illegal. The deputy sighed. He tucked the clipboard under his arm and hooked his thumbs into his belt. Ma'am, I am not a judge. I am not a lawyer. I have a court order that says you have no legal right to be on these premises. I am giving you a courtesy right now. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a warning rumble. You have until 12 noon. 12 noon. I stared at him. It was 3 minutes past 6. He was giving me less than 6 hours to dismantle my entire life. If you are not vacated by 12 noon, he continued, his eyes locking onto mine, I will return with a locksmith and a moving crew. We will physically remove you from the premises, and the locks will be changed. Anything left inside will be considered abandoned property. Do you understand? I felt the blood drain from my face. Abandoned property, my computer, my files, the jewelry my grandmother left me, the photos, the life I had built brick by brick to escape the very people standing across the street. They wanted to erase it all. I understand that you are threatening me, I said, my voice hardening. But you are making a mistake. The deputy stepped back, his face closing off. The courtesy window was closed. 12 noon, ma'am. He turned and walked back toward his patrol car. He didn't look at my parents, but I did. Gabriel was nodding slowly, as if approving of the deputy's performance. Elena was still watching me, her expression unreadable now, masking the glee she had shown just seconds before. They stood there like statues, monuments to a betrayal so deep I couldn't even see the bottom of it. I closed the door. I slid the deadbolt home. I engaged the chain. The silence of the house rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was holding its breath. I leaned my back against the wood of the door and slid down until I hit the floor, the cold hardwood biting into my legs. My hands were shaking so hard I had to clasp them together to stop the tremors. 12 noon. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hallway. The pendulum swung back and forth, counting down the seconds. 1, 2, 3. I had 6 hours to fight a war I didn't even know I was in. I had 6 hours to figure out how the two people who gave me life had managed to sign a piece of paper that turned me into a trespasser in my own home. I pushed myself up from the floor. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp anger that felt like swallowed glass. They thought they had won. They thought the deputy and the badge and the clipboard would make me crumble. They thought Kylie Perez was just a scared little girl who would pack a bag and run. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the coffee maker, the red light blinking. 12 noon. I whispered to the empty room, let's see what I can do in 6 hours. I scrambled to my feet, the cold wood of the floorboards biting into my palms as I pushed myself up. The silence in the hallway was deafening, amplified by the ticking of the grandfather clock that felt less like a timekeeper and more like a countdown to an execution. My heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but the initial paralyzing wave of shock was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I could not just sit here. I could not just wait for 12 noon to arrive like a guillotine blade. If I stayed behind this door, huddled in the dark, I was just a victim waiting to be carried out. I needed to be a strategist. I needed information. I reached for the deadbolt again, my fingers trembling slightly but moving with purpose. I snapped the lock back, but I kept the security chain firmly in place. I cracked the door open 4 inches. The morning air sliced through the gap, carrying the scent of dew and the exhaust from the deputy's idling patrol car. He was halfway to his vehicle, his boots crunching on my gravel driveway, clearly eager to put this domestic dispute in his rearview mirror. "Officer!" I yelled through the crack. My voice was raw, scraping against my throat, but it was loud enough. He stopped, his hand resting on the driver's side door handle. He turned back, his expression a mix of exhaustion and irritation. He clearly thought we were done. He thought he had delivered his lines, set the timer, and could now go grab a coffee while my life imploded. "I need to see the paperwork," I called out. He hesitated, looking from me to the car and back again. For a second, I thought he was going to refuse, to tell me to call the clerk's office when they opened at 8, effectively burning 2 more hours of my limited time. But then he sighed, a heavy shifting of his shoulders, and walked back up the driveway. He didn't step onto the porch this time. He stood on the bottom step, maintaining a distance that felt both professional and wary. He held the clipboard up, but he didn't hand it to me. He kept it tucked against his chest. "I cannot give you these copies, ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "You were supposed to receive your own set when you were served. I was never served." I snapped, the words coming out sharper than I intended. I pressed my face closer to the gap in the door, gripping the brass chain with white-knuckled fingers. "I have never seen that document in my life. If you are going to kick me out of my own house in less than 6 hours, the very least you can do is let me read the death warrant." The deputy looked at me, really looked at me, through the narrow opening. He must have seen something in my eyes, maybe the desperation, or maybe the cold fury that was starting to override the fear. He stepped up onto the porch, closing the distance. He turned the clipboard sideways, angling it so the morning light hit the paper, and held it up to the crack in the door. I squinted, my eyes adjusting to the glare. It was a dense thicket of legal jargon, a wall of text designed to intimidate and confuse, but I forced myself to ignore the dense paragraphs and look for the anchors. I needed the facts. My eyes latched onto the case number first. It was stamped in the upper right corner, CV 2026000491. It looked official. It looked terrifyingly real. Below it was the seal of the Superior Court, embossed and heavy, and at the bottom, a signature. It was a scrawl of black ink, hurried and illegible, but it carried the weight of a judge's authority. This wasn't a fake letter typed up on a home computer. This was a valid court order. I scanned the header, writ of possession. The words made my stomach turn. It sounded like something from an exorcism, not a property dispute. "Who filed this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer in my gut. I needed to hear him say it. I needed it to be part of the record between us. "Who is the plaintiff?" The deputy pulled the clipboard back slightly to read the top line himself. He started to speak automatically, like he was reading a menu. But then he paused. His eyes flicked from the paper to the house across the street, where my parents were still standing by the mailbox, watching us. He looked back at the paper, and a shadow crossed his face. It was a moment of realization. The moment he understood this wasn't a bank foreclosing on a deadbeat, or a landlord evicting a rowdy tenant. He realized he was the weapon in a family war. The plaintiffs are listed as Elena Perez and Gabriel Perez, he said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the bureaucratic edge it had held earlier. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the names hit me. Hearing a stranger speak them in this context finalized it. It made them adversaries, not mom and dad, plaintiffs. And when was this judgment entered? I asked, opening my eyes. When did a judge decide I didn't own my home? The deputy ran his finger down the page, tracing the timeline of my destruction. Default judgment was entered last Tuesday, he said. The writ was issued yesterday afternoon. Last Tuesday. My mind raced back. Last Tuesday. I had been here. I remembered it perfectly. It was a rainy day. I had worked from home, sitting at the kitchen island with my laptop, drinking tea. I hadn't left the house all day. No one had come to the door. No process server. No FedEx delivery. No taping of documents to the front gate. The house had been as quiet as a tomb. Default judgment, I repeated. The words tasting like ash. That means I didn't show up. I didn't defend myself. That is usually what it means. Yes, the deputy confirmed. Because I didn't know, I hissed. You can't defend yourself against a sneak attack. I looked at the paperwork again, searching for the loose thread, the lie that held this entire tapestry together. If they got a default judgment, they had to prove to a judge that they had told me about the lawsuit. They had to prove service. Where was I served? I demanded. Show me the proof of service. The deputy hesitated again. He flipped the page on the clipboard, revealing a second document underneath the writ. This one was a grid of checkboxes and handwritten notes. He scanned it, his brow furrowing. It says here service was completed via substituted service. He read, the papers were left with a co-resident at the defendant's address of record. Read the address, I commanded. My voice was trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the anticipation of the trap snapping shut. He read it out loud. 402, North Oakhaven Drive. The world stopped spinning for a second. The air left the porch. 402 North Oakhaven Drive. It wasn't my address. It wasn't even close. My house, the one I was standing in, was on Elm Street. Oakhaven Drive was 5 miles away, but I knew that house. I knew every inch of it. It was an old rental property my parents had owned for 20 years. We had lived there when I was a teenager. During the years when their control over me was absolute, it was the house where they read my diaries. It was the house where they took the door off my bedroom hinges so I could never have privacy. It was the house where I learned to hide money in the hollow curtain rods so I could eventually escape. They had sold that house 3 years ago, or so I thought. Or maybe they had kept it. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was an address they controlled, an address where they held the keys, an address where they could collect the mail. They served themselves, I whispered. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Excuse me? The deputy asked, looking up. That is not my house, I said, my voice rising. I haven't lived at Oakhaven Drive since I was 19 years old. I am 29. That address it's theirs. Or it was. They used an old address to make sure I never saw the papers. The deputy looked uncomfortable. He looked at the proof of service again, seeing the cracks in the facade. It is listed here as your residence, ma'am. The process server signed a sworn affidavit that he left the papers with a competent member of the household at that address. Yeah, I bet he did. I said bitterly, I bet he left them with my mother. I looked past the deputy, past the patrol car, to the figures across the street. Elena was checking her watch. Gabriel was staring at the second floor of my house, probably already calculating how much they could sell it for. They filed a lawsuit, I said, speaking fast now, the pieces clicking into place. They listed an address they knew I didn't live at, but one that would look legitimate enough on paper because of my history there. They accepted the service themselves. They waited the mandatory 5 days for me to respond. When I didn't respond, because I didn't know, they filed for a default judgment. They walked into court, told a judge I was ignoring the law, and got a writ of possession. It was brilliant. It was evil. It was procedural warfare. The deputy shifted his weight. He was a law enforcement officer, not a judge. His job was to enforce the paper, not to analyze the backstory, but I could see the doubt creeping in. He knew something stank. You didn't need a law degree to smell the rot in this situation. Ma'am, he said, his tone softening just a fraction. If what you are saying is true, then this is a civil matter you need to take up with the court. There is no time, I shouted, the panic flaring again. You said noon. It is 6:15 in the morning. Even if I get a lawyer, the court doesn't open until 8. By the time anyone looks at this, you will be drilling my locks. That is the procedure, he said, retreating behind the shield of protocol, unless I get a stay from a judge. The order stands. He pulled the clipboard back. The glimpse into the mechanics of my destruction was over. You have the case number now, he said. CV 2026000491. If I were you, I would get down to the courthouse the second the doors unlock, but do not think that buying time will stop me from coming back. If I do not have a stay order in my hand by 12 noon, you are out. He turned and walked away. This time, he didn't look back. He got into his patrol car, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled away from the curb, leaving me alone in the silence. I watched him go. Then I looked across the street. My parents hadn't moved. They saw the deputy leave. They saw me still standing behind the door. Elena raised her hand and gave a small, distinct wave. It wasn't a greeting. It was a dismissal. I slammed the door shut and locked the deadbolt. My breath was coming in short. sharp gasps. They didn't just want the house. If they wanted the house, they could have fought me for the deed in open court. They could have tried to claim I owed them money. But that would have taken months. That would have given me a chance to speak. This was a blitzkrieg. They wanted me panicked. They wanted me to look at that deputy, hear the words 12 noon, and crumble. They expected me to spend the next 6 hours crying, packing boxes, and calling them to beg for mercy. They expected me to throw clothes into garbage bags and flee, leaving the house empty for them to seize. Once I was out, possession was 9/10 of the law. Trying to get back in would be 10 times harder than staying in. They were counting on my fear. They were counting on the fact that I didn't know how the system worked. They were counting on the shock of the morning raid to paralyze my logic. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. 402 Oakhaven Drive. The address where I had spent years learning to be quiet, learning to make myself small so I wouldn't trigger an explosion. They used that ghost to haunt me one last time. But I wasn't 19 anymore, and I wasn't the girl who hid money in curtain rods. I pushed myself off the door. I walked into the kitchen, the morning light spilling across the granite countertops I had paid for, illuminating the coffee mug I had left in the sink the night before. "I am not packing," I said to the empty room. I reached for my phone on the counter. My hands were steady now. The tremor was gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus. I am not going to be a victim today. I am going to be a problem. I needed to move. I needed to document. I needed to build a record that would choke them. The deputy had given me the weapon, even if he didn't mean to. I had the case number. I knew the lie. Now I just had to prove it. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 6:20 in the morning, 5 hours and 40 minutes left. I unlocked the screen of my phone and opened the camera app. Then I walked back to the front door, undid the locks, and stepped out onto the porch. My parents were still there. They stiffened when they saw me come out. I didn't look at them. I lifted my phone and took a photo of the empty driveway where the deputy had been. Then I turned and took a photo of them. Elena took a step back, surprised. Gabriel frowned. I lowered the phone. "I'll see you in court," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. And then I went back inside to prepare for war. I locked the deadbolt and leaned back against the door, the wood cool against my spine. The house was silent again, but the silence had changed texture. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of victimhood. It was the sharp, electric silence of a war room before the first strike. The clock in the hallway chimed the half hour. 6:30 in the morning. I had 5 hours and 30 minutes. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. Panic was for people who didn't understand how the world worked. Panic was what Elena and Gabriel Perez were counting on. They wanted me to spend the next few hours sobbing into a pillow or frantically throwing clothes into suitcases. They wanted me to be the emotional daughter, the one who reacted, but I wasn't going to react. I was going to respond. I pushed myself off the door and moved toward the kitchen. My movements were no longer frantic. They were precise. I imagined a switch in my brain flipping from daughter to defense attorney. I didn't have a law degree, but I knew how to build a narrative. And right now, the narrative on record was that I was a squatter in my own home. I had to dismantle that story, sentence by sentence, document by document. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the gallery. My thumb hovered over the last 3 images. In that brief, tense standoff at the door, while the deputy had held the clipboard up to the crack. I hadn't just been reading, I had been recording. I had tapped the shutter button 3 times, capturing the documents he refused to give me. The photos were slightly angled, the lighting poor, but the text was legible. I sat down at the kitchen island and zoomed in on the first image. Case number CV 2026000491. I memorized it. I repeated it out loud until the rhythm of the numbers settled into my bones. That string of digits was my identity now. I swiped to the next photo, the proof of service. I stared at the signature line. It was a scribble, hasty and indifferent, signed by a process server who had likely never set foot on this street. And below it, The checkbox for substituted service. The claim that the papers were left with a Jane Doe at 402 North Oakhaven Drive. I felt a cold burn in my chest. That address was the smoking gun. If I could prove I didn't live there, the service was invalid. If the service was invalid, the default judgment was void. If the judgment was void, the eviction died, but proving it required more than just my word. In the eyes of the law, if it wasn't on paper, it didn't happen. I stood up and walked to the master bedroom, straight to the walk-in closet. On the top shelf, buried behind a stack of winter sweaters, was a small, heavy black pouch, fireproof, waterproof, disaster-proof. I pulled it down and unzipped it on the bed. Inside was the paper trail of my independence. I bypassed my birth certificate and passport. I went straight for the deed. It was a thick document, the edges crisp, grant deed. I ran my fingers over my name typed in capital letters. Kylie Perez, a single woman. Not Elena Perez, not Gabriel Perez, just me. I found the page with the notary seal from 3 years ago, the day I bought the house. I found the title insurance policy. I found the property tax statements for the last 3 years, all addressed to this house, all marked paid. I grabbed a stack of utility bills, water, electricity, internet, all in my name, all tied to this address on Elm Street. These weren't just papers, they were ammunition. I carried the stack to the kitchen table. It was 7 o'clock. The courthouse civil division wouldn't open the phone lines until 8. I had an hour to organize the chaos into a weapon. I laid everything out in a grid. Exhibit A, the deed. Exhibit B, the tax records. Exhibit C, the utility bills. Exhibit D, the fraudulent service record on my phone. I sat there, watching the minutes tick by on the microwave clock. 7:15, 7:30, 7:45. At 7:59, I dialed the number for the Superior Court Civil Division. I held the phone to my ear, my posture rigid, staring at the wall. Thank you for calling the Superior Court. I bypassed the automated menu, hitting 0, then 4, then 0 again, navigating the maze with aggressive speed. Civil Division. This is Marcus. How can I help you? The voice was tired, clipped. It was the voice of a man who had already dealt with too many problems before his morning coffee was finished. Good morning, I said. My voice was calm, pitched low and serious. I needed to sound like a professional, not a hysterical woman losing her home. I need information on an active unlawful detainer case. Case number CV 202-600-491. I heard the clicking of a keyboard on the other end. One moment, Marcus mumbled. The silence stretched. I watched a bird land on the windowsill, oblivious to the fact that the woman inside was fighting for her life. Okay, I have it, Marcus said. Perez versus Perez. Judgment for possession entered by default on January 28th. Writ of possession issued yesterday. Looks like the sheriff is scheduled for lockout today. I took a breath. I am the defendant. Kylie Perez. I said clearly, I was never served with this lawsuit. The proof of service lists an address that I have not lived at in 10 years. I am currently in possession of the property, and the sheriff was at my door this morning threatening a lockout by noon. There was a pause. The boredom in Marcus's voice shifted slightly. Okay, ma'am. If judgment has already been entered, the case is technically closed. The only way to stop the lockout is to get a judge to sign an order to show cause to stay the eviction. How do I do that? I asked. You need to come down here, he said, reciting the procedure. You need to file an ex parte application to stay execution of judgment and a motion to set aside the default. You will need to bring your evidence. Can I do this electronically? I asked. Not if you want it heard today, he replied. Electronic filings take 24 hours to process. If the sheriff is coming at noon, you need to walk it into the courtroom yourself. I checked the clock. 8:10. Is there a judge available? Judge Marston is hearing ex parte matters at 8:30 in Department 4. Marcus said, If you get here fast, the clerk might let you squeeze it in. Otherwise, you are waiting until the afternoon calendar. I don't have until the afternoon. I said, The sheriff said 12 noon. Then you better hurry, Marcus said. And ma'am? Yes? Make sure you bring 3 copies of everything. The court hates it when you don't have copies. I hung up. 3 copies. I grabbed the stack of documents, the deed, the bills, the tax statements, and ran to the home office printer in the guest room. I slammed the papers onto the scanner glass, hitting the copy button with frantic repetition. The machine whirred and clicked, agonizingly slow. Whir, click, slide. I tapped my foot against the floor, watching the paper tray fill up. Every second the printer took was a second deducted from my survival time, while the printer churned. I thought about the deputy. I thought about the way he had looked at me through the crack in the door, the shift in his eyes when he realized my parents were enjoying the show a little too much. I remembered something else. In the chaos of the morning, in the adrenaline haze of the confrontation, there had been a moment I hadn't fully processed until now. Just before he turned to walk back to his patrol car, just before I slammed the door, he had done something off the books. He had been holding the clipboard against his chest, shielding it from my parents' view. As he delivered his final warning about the noon deadline, his hand had moved. He had slid a small, white business card from under the clip and pushed it through the gap in the door, pressing it into my palm. "If you get assigned stay, call this," he had muttered, his lips barely moving. I had shoved the card into my robe pocket without looking at it. Now, I dug it out. It was a plain card with the sheriff's department logo. Handwritten on the back in blue ballpoint ink was a direct number. Not the dispatch line, not the front desk, a direct line. Sergeant, Miller, Civil Enforcement Unit. He had given me a lifeline. He knew. He knew this was a setup, but his hands were tied by the court order. He couldn't stop the eviction, but he had given me the direct line to the person who could call off the dogs if I got the judge to agree. I stared at the number. 323-555-0199. I tucked the card into my bra. It was the most valuable thing I owned right now. The printer spit out the last copy of the deed. I grabbed the warm stack of papers, ignoring the paper cut that sliced across my thumb. I didn't feel the pain. I felt only the cold, hard drive of necessity. I ran back to the kitchen, swept the fireproof pouch and the fresh copies into my leather tote bag. I grabbed my car keys. I paused for 1 second at the front door. I checked the peephole. The street was empty. My parents were gone. They had probably gone to a diner to celebrate their victory with pancakes and coffee, confident that by lunchtime they would be changing the locks on my house. I opened the door and stepped out into the morning light. The air was crisp, indifferent to my crisis. I locked the door behind me, a futile gesture if I failed, but a necessary act of defiance. I marched to my car, threw the bag into the passenger seat, and keyed the ignition. The engine roared to life. I reversed out of the driveway, my tires gripping the asphalt. I didn't look at the neighbor's house. I didn't look at the empty spot where the patrol car had been. I looked straight ahead, toward the highway that led to the county courthouse. I wasn't Kylie the daughter anymore. I wasn't Kylie the victim. I was the defendant, and I was going to court. I merged onto the main road, pressing the accelerator until the speedometer climbed past 40, then 50. I had 4 hours until noon. I checked the time on the dashboard, 8:25. I had 5 minutes to get to the courthouse and find Department 4 before Judge Marston took the bench. I drove like a lawyer, fast, aggressive, and with total disregard for anything that wasn't the objective. The road blurred past me, but my mind was already in the courtroom, rehearsing the opening line. "Your Honor, my name is Kylie Perez, and I am here to report a fraud." The county courthouse was a monolith of gray stone that seemed designed to make a human being feel small. I parked my car in the overpriced structure across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel for one last second of grounding before I stepped into the arena. I checked my phone. It was 8:45 in the morning. I had made it, but the margin for error was razor thin. I ran across the street, dodging the morning commuter traffic, and joined the line forming outside the metal detectors. The air inside the revolving doors hit me first. A specific, institutional cocktail of industrial-strength disinfectant, floor wax, and the acrid, lingering scent of burnt coffee from the vending machines in the basement. It was the smell of bad news. No one came here because they were having a good day. They came here for divorces, for bankruptcies, for restraining orders, and for evictions. I moved through the security checkpoint with mechanical efficiency, belt off, shoes off, bag on the belt. I watched my fireproof pouch slide through the X-ray machine. A dark rectangle on the monitor that held the only proof I had that I wasn't crazy. I stepped through the scanner, grabbed my things, and didn't bother putting my belt back on until I was halfway to the elevators. The civil division was on the second floor. The hallway was long and lined with wooden benches where people sat with their heads in their hands, clutching folders of paperwork that likely determined their future. I didn't sit. I walked straight to the clerk's filing window. There was a glass partition separating the public from the machinery of justice. On the other side, rows of metal shelving stretched back into the gloom, stuffed with manila folders. A clerk sat at the window, a man with thinning hair and glasses sliding down his nose. He looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weary that comes from years of listening to people lie, cry, and beg. "Next," he called out, his voice flat. I stepped up to the window. I didn't plead. I didn't cry. I placed my driver's license and my list of case numbers on the counter. "I need to see the file for case number CV2026000491, I said. "Perez versus Perez." The clerk sighed, a long exhale that fogged the glass slightly. He typed the number into his computer, his fingers moving with the sluggish rhythm of someone counting down the minutes to retirement. "That is a closed case," he said without looking up. "Judgment entered. Writ issued. It is done. It is not done," I said, leaning in. "I am the defendant. I am here to file an emergency motion to vacate the judgment and stay the eviction, but I need to see the proof of service first." He looked at me then, really looked at me. He saw the fireproof pouch, the organized stack of papers, the lack of tears. He saw someone who was ready to work, not just complain. He pushed his chair back and walked into the labyrinth of shelves. I waited. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sound like trapped flies. Minutes ticked by. 2 minutes. 3. I watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep past the 12. Then the 3. Then the 6. Every tick was a step closer to the deputy returning to my house with a drill. The clerk returned with a thin file folder. He opened it on the counter, keeping his hand over it as if I might try to snatch it and run. "Here's the original," he said. "You can look, but you cannot touch." I scanned the top document. It was the request for entry of default, but I needed the layer beneath it. "Turn the page." "Please," I said. He flipped it over. There it was, the proof of service of summons. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, reading the fine print. The process server had checked the box for substituted service. That meant they claimed I wasn't home, so they gave the papers to someone else who lived there. I read the line describing the person who accepted the papers. Adult female occupant, height, 5'4", hair, brown, relationship to defendant, mother, and then, the name. Printed clearly in black ink was the name of the person who had accepted the lawsuit on my behalf, Elena Perez. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It was so brazen it was almost impressive. "Look at the name," I said to the clerk, pointing through the glass. He squinted. "Elena Perez. So? Look at the plaintiff line on the front of the file," I said. He flipped the file cover closed and read the label. Plaintiffs, Elena Perez and Gabriel Perez. He flipped the file open again. He looked at the service record. Received by Elena Perez. His eyes widened. He looked from the paper to me, then back to the paper. The boredom evaporated from his face, replaced by a frown of professional confusion. "She served herself," he muttered. He sounded offended on behalf of the system. "The plaintiff cannot accept service for the defendant. That is a conflict of interest. That is improper service. She accepted the papers to sue me, from herself, at an address I don't live at." I said, my voice shaking with the effort to stay calm. "And she did it to ensure I never knew about the hearing until the sheriff showed up this morning." The clerk didn't say anything. He stood there for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of the maneuver. Then, quietly, he reached for the print button on his keyboard. The machine behind him whirred to life. He slid a fresh copy of the document under the glass partition. "I am not supposed to give legal advice," he said, his voice low, glancing around to make sure no supervisors were watching. "But if I were you, I would take a yellow highlighter and mark that line. Make sure the judge cannot miss it. It matters." "Thank you," I whispered, taking the paper. He wasn't done. He was flipping through the rest of the file now. His curiosity piqued. He was looking for the supporting evidence. In an unlawful detainer case, you have to prove there is a landlord-tenant relationship. You have to prove there is a lease. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Is this your signature?" he asked, sliding the file closer to the glass. I looked at the document. It was titled Residential Rental Agreement. It was dated 6 months ago. It listed Elena and Gabriel Perez as the landlords and me as the tenant. The monthly rent was listed as $2,000. I looked at the bottom of the page. There was a signature above my printed name. It was a loops and swirls cursive that looked nothing like my jagged, rapid autograph. It looked like someone had tried to copy a signature from a birthday card I had signed 10 years ago and gave up halfway through. It was shaky. It was hesitant. It was a forgery so lazy it was insulting. "No," I said, "that is not my signature, and I don't pay rent. I own the house." The clerk paused. His hand hovered over the next document in the stack. He looked at me with a strange expression, pity mixed with a grim sort of respect. "You might want to brace yourself," he said softly. He turned the last page over. Attached to the complaint was a copy of a quitclaim deed. I felt the blood drain from my face. I pressed my hands against the counter to keep from swaying. The deed was dated 2 weeks ago. It detailed a transfer of property, my property on Elm Street, from Kylie Perez to Elena Perez and Gabriel Perez. It claimed I had gifted the house back to them for the sum of $10. $10. My parents hadn't just tried to evict me. They had stolen the title. They had forged a deed, walked into the county recorder's office, and transferred my biggest asset into their names while I was sitting at work, completely oblivious. They didn't just want me out. They wanted to erase my ownership entirely. "This was recorded on January 15th, the clerk said, tapping the date stamp in the corner. "It is a certified copy from the recorder's office. As far as the court is concerned, according to this piece of paper, they are the legal owners." I felt a wave of nausea. It was a violation so deep it felt physical. They had impersonated me. They had forged my name. They had looked a notary in the eye and lied. I took a deep breath, forcing the air into my lungs. "It is a forgery," I said. "I didn't sign that. I was at work. I have security logs to prove it." The clerk nodded slowly. He believed me. I could see it in his eyes. The sloppy service, the fake lease, the sudden deed. It all painted a picture of a rush job. A smash-and-grab robbery committed with paperwork instead of crowbars. "Here is what you need to do," he said, sliding a packet of blank forms under the glass. "This is the ex parte kit. You need to fill out the application for a stay and the declaration in support of the motion to set aside the default." He looked at the clock on the wall. "Judge Marston takes the bench in 20 minutes. If you get this filed in 10 minutes, I can walk the file back to her chambers before she goes on the record. If you miss that window, she won't see it until the afternoon break. And by the afternoon break," I said, "the sheriff will have changed my locks." "Exactly," the clerk said. "Write fast, but write clearly. If she can't read it, she won't grant it." I took the forms and moved to a small wooden table against the wall. It was covered in scratches and graffiti, the desperate scrawls of people who had sat here before me. I uncapped my black pen. My hand was shaking. I watched the tip of the pen quiver over the white paper. "Stop it," I told myself. "Panic is how you lose credibility." If my handwriting looked shaky, I looked unstable. If I looked unstable, my mother's narrative that I was troubled or erratic gained traction. I needed to look like a surgeon cutting out a tumor. I forced my hand to still. I took a breath and began to write. I, Kylie Perez. Declare under penalty of perjury that the following is true and correct. I wrote slowly, deliberately. I formed every letter with architectural precision. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't write, "My parents are liars." I wrote facts. Fact 1. The service of process was defective because the plaintiff accepted service on behalf of the defendant. Fact 2. The service address is not the defendant's residence. Fact 3. The lease agreement attached as Exhibit A is a forgery. Fact 4. The quitclaim deed attached as Exhibit B is a forgery. I did not sign it. I did not authorize it. The room around me faded away. I didn't hear the hum of the vending machine or the murmur of other people at the counter. My world narrowed down to the tip of my pen and the blank white space of the affidavit. I was building a wall. I was building a shield. I checked the clock. 8:55. I had 5 minutes to finish the narrative, attach my exhibits, and get it back to the window. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photos I had printed at home. I pulled out the copy of my real deed. I pulled out the utility bill showing my service address. I stapled them to the back of the declaration. The sound of the stapler was loud in the quiet room. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It sounded like gunshots. I stood up and walked back to the window. The clerk was helping another customer, a man arguing about a parking ticket. I didn't wait. I stepped up to the side of the opening and slid the thick packet of paperwork across the counter. The clerk stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the packet. He looked at the clock. He nodded at me. A sharp, imperceptible dip of his chin. He grabbed the file, slapped a received stamp on the top page with a heavy thud, and turned his back on the counter. I watched him walk through the door at the back of the office, the door that led to the judge's chambers. He was carrying my life in his hands. I stood there, alone at the window, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had done my part. I had built the record. Now I had to walk into a courtroom and face the people who had raised me, the people who had just tried to steal my existence with a $10 stamp. I turned away from the window and headed toward the double doors of Department 4. The smell of burnt coffee was stronger now, or maybe it was just the taste of adrenaline in the back of my throat. I was ready, or as ready as I would ever be. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of Department 4. The air inside was significantly colder than the hallway, a manufactured chill designed to keep tempers low and heart rates steady. It didn't work. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. The courtroom was sparse. A few lawyers sat in the gallery, whispering over files, waiting for their cases to be called, but my eyes went instantly to the front row, to the plaintiff's table on the right. They were there. Elena and Gabriel Perez sat with their backs to me, but I knew the set of their shoulders. My mother was wearing a soft, powder blue cardigan, a deliberate choice. It was her harmless grandmother costume, the one she wore to church or to parent-teacher conferences when she wanted to manipulate a situation with perceived fragility. My father sat stiffly beside her in his Sunday suit. Next to them sat a man I didn't know, but I recognized the type immediately. He was polished to a high shine. His suit was a sharp charcoal gray, tailored to within an inch of its life. His hair was gelled back with aggressive precision, and he was tapping a gold pen against a leather-bound folio. This was Caleb Hart. I had seen his name on the bottom of the complaint. He was the kind of attorney you hired when you wanted to bury someone, not when you wanted to resolve a family dispute. I walked down the center aisle. The sound of my boots on the industrial carpet seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. I didn't look at my parents as I passed the bar. I walked straight to the defendant's table on the left and set my bag down. My mother turned. She looked at me with wide, sad eyes, a look of practiced devastation. It was a look that said, "Look what you are making us do." It made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and nausea. I ignored her and faced the bench. The clerk I had met downstairs came through the side door. He was carrying the file, my file, and he placed it squarely in front of the judge's empty chair. He caught my eye for a split second, a barely perceptible nod, before retreating to his desk. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. "Department 4 is now in session." The Honorable Judge Marston presiding. Judge Marston swept in. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair cut in a sharp bob and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. She didn't look tired. She looked efficient. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and opened the file in front of her. She didn't speak. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the rustle of paper as she turned the pages. I saw her pause. She had reached the yellow highlighter mark. She lingered there, her eyebrows drawing together in a frown that deepened with every second. She flipped the page. She looked at the forged lease. She flipped again. She looked at the deed. Finally, she looked up. Her gaze bypassed the attorneys and landed on me. Then it shifted to my parents. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Calling the matter of Perez versus Perez," she said, her voice dry and authoritative. "I have an emergency ex parte application to stay execution of a writ of possession, filed this morning by the defendant, Kylie Perez." She looked at me. "State your appearance, Kylie Perez, defendant, representing myself." I said. My voice was steady, clearer than I felt. Caleb Hart stood up smoothly. "Caleb Hart for the plaintiffs, Elena and Gabriel Perez. Your Honor, we are surprised to be here. We were under the impression that the lockout was proceeding as scheduled for 12 noon today." "I am sure you were," Judge Marston said. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the proof of service document again. "Ms. Perez," the judge said to me, "you are claiming you were not served with this lawsuit. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Your Honor." I said, "I was never served. I had no knowledge of this action until a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door at 6 o'clock this morning." Hart cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may, there is a valid proof of service in the file. Substituted service was accomplished on January 15th at the defendant's residence. All procedural requirements were met." The judge held up a hand. Silencing him, "I am looking at the proof of service, Mr. Hart," she said, "and I have some questions about it." She turned her gaze to me. "Ms. Perez, do you reside at 402 North Oakhaven Drive?" "No, Your Honor." I said, "I reside at 778 Elm Street. The property in question, the property I own. I haven't lived at the Oakhaven address in over 10 years. That is a rental property owned by the plaintiffs." I saw Hart stiffen slightly. He hadn't expected that. He had probably just looked at the papers his clients gave him and assumed they were accurate. Judge Marston turned to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Hart, why was service attempted at an address the defendant does not occupy?" Hart adjusted his cuffs. "Your Honor, my clients believed in good faith that the defendant was staying at the Oakhaven property during a period of personal instability. It was their understanding that she was moving between residences. Personal instability, there it was, the narrative." And the judge continued, ignoring his explanation, "I see here that the person who accepted service, the Jane Doe, listed on the affidavit, is named Elena Perez." She lowered the paper and looked over her reading glasses at my mother. "Is the plaintiff Elena Perez present?" My mother stood up. She looked small and frail, clutching a tissue in her hand. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. "Ma'am, you are the plaintiff in this case, correct? You are the one suing your daughter?" "Yes," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Then can you explain to me," the judge asked, her voice sharpening like a blade, "why you accepted service of the lawsuit on behalf of the defendant?" Elena looked at Hart. Hart looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I was just trying to make sure she got it," Elena stammered. "I wanted to keep it safe for her. Kylie has been having a hard time. We didn't want to upset her. So you served yourself." Judge Marston summarized flatly. "You filed a lawsuit, handed the papers to yourself at a house your daughter doesn't live in, and then told the court she had been properly notified, Your Honor." Hart interjected, trying to regain control. "Under the Code of Civil Procedure, Section 415.20, substituted service is valid if left with a competent member of the household. Mrs. Perez was simply—" The judge cut him off with a look that could have stripped paint. "Mr. Hart, Do not quote the code to me while your client is standing there admitting to a fraudulent service. The plaintiff cannot serve the defendant. That is the first thing they teach you in law school. It is a fundamental conflict of interest. And doing it at a false address? That looks a lot like extrinsic fraud. She turned back to the file. But that is not the only thing that smells wrong here, she muttered. She pulled out the deed. The document my parents had forged to steal the house. I am looking at Exhibit B attached to the complaint, she said. A quitclaim deed. Recorded on January 15th. It purports to transfer the property from Kylie Perez to Elena and Gabriel Perez for the sum of $10. She looked at me. Ms. Perez, did you sign this deed? No, Your Honor, I said firmly. I absolutely did not. Hart jumped in again. Your Honor, the deed is notarized. It is a recorded public document. It carries a presumption of validity. If the defendant has seller's remorse now, that is a separate issue to be litigated in a quiet title action. It is not grounds to stop an eviction on a property she no longer owns. Seller's remorse? I felt the anger flash hot behind my eyes. It is a forgery, I said, my voice rising slightly. I was at work on January 15th. I work for a defense contractor. I was inside a secure facility from 8 in the morning until 6 at night. I have badge logs and camera footage to prove I could not possibly have been at a notary's office signing away my home for the price of a sandwich. Hart smirked, a tiny condescending twitch of his lips. Badge logs, he repeated, as if I had said I had a note from my imaginary friend. Judge Marston didn't smirk. She looked at me with intense interest. You have these logs? She asked. I have requested them. Your Honor, I said, I will have them certified by tomorrow. But I have my pay stubs and my own sworn declaration here today. The judge nodded. She looked back at the deed. She studied the notary stamp. Sabrina Cole. She read, that is the notary. She looked at Elena again. Mrs. Perez, were you present when this deed was signed? Elena hesitated. She looked at Gabriel, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. She looked at Hart, then she looked at the judge. Yes, she said softly. We were all there. Kylie signed it. She wanted us to take the house. She said it was too much responsibility for her. She cried and thanked us. The lie was so grotesque, so completely inverted from reality, that I actually gasped. She is lying. I said, Ms. Perez, quiet, the judge snapped. But there was no heat in it. She was focused on my mother. So you are telling me, the judge said slowly, that your daughter voluntarily gave you her house 2 weeks ago, and now she is fighting an eviction from that same house with an emergency motion and allegations of fraud? She changed her mind, Elena said, a tear slipping down her cheek. She is not well, Your Honor. She has episodes. We are just trying to help her. We want to get her into a facility where she can be cared for. That is why we need possession of the home. To manage her assets. The room went silent. Hart looked relieved. He thought the concerned parent angle was working. Judge Marston stared at Elena for a long, uncomfortable moment. She tapped her finger against the file. I don't see any medical evidence of incapacity in this file, Mr. Hart, the judge said. I don't see a conservatorship. I don't see a power of attorney. All I see is a default judgment obtained through questionable service and a deed that the defendant claims is a forgery. She slammed the file shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Here is the order, she announced. Hart stood up, ready to object. Sit down. Counsel, she barked. The tentative ruling is finalized as follows. The motion to stay execution of the writ of possession is granted. I felt my knees go weak with relief. I grabbed the edge of the table to hold myself up. The sheriff is ordered to stand down immediately. She continued, her voice rapid and precise. The lockout scheduled for 12 noon is canceled. But, Your Honor, Hart started. I am not finished. Judge Marston's voice boomed. She turned to the clerk. I am issuing an order to show cause regarding the validity of the default judgment, and I am issuing a subpoena for the notary public. Sabrina Cole. I want her in this courtroom tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp, and I want her notary journal. If that deed was signed, there will be a thumbprint and a journal entry. If there isn't, we are going to have a very different conversation. She looked at Hart. You will ensure the notary is served with this order. Mr. Hart, since your clients were the beneficiaries of this transaction, I assume they know where to find her. Hart looked pale. The polished veneer had cracked. Yes, Your Honor, he muttered. And Mrs. Perez, the judge added, her eyes locking onto my mother. Elena looked up, her performance of sorrow faltering under the judge's glare. If I find out that you lied to this court about the service of process, or if that deed turns out to be fraudulent, I will refer this entire matter to the district attorney. Do you understand me? Elena nodded, her face ashen. Yes, we are back here tomorrow at 9 a.m., the judge said. Stay is in effect until then. She banged the gavel. Department 4 is in recess. The bailiff moved toward the door. The energy in the room had shifted violently. 5 minutes ago, I was a daughter about to be homeless. Now, I was a plaintiff in the making. I packed my papers into my bag. My hands were shaking, but this time it was from adrenaline, not fear. I turned to leave. I had to walk past them. Hart was whispering furiously to my father. Elena was staring at me, her eyes hard and cold, the sad mother mask completely gone. You ungrateful girl, she hissed as I passed. After everything we did for you, I stopped. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't feel the old guilt. I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I leaned in close, so only she could hear. You didn't do this for me, I whispered. You did it to me, and now you are going to explain it to the judge. I walked out of the courtroom and into the hallway. I didn't stop. I walked straight to the elevators, pulled the deputy's card out of my bra, and dialed the number for the civil enforcement unit. The phone rang twice. Sergeant, Miller. A gruff voice answered. This is Kylie Perez. I said, I have a signed stay from Judge Marston. There was a pause on the other end. Then, a sound that might have been a chuckle. I figured you might, he said. Bring it down. I will call the deputies off. I hung up the phone. I looked at the time. It was 9:45 in the morning. I had won the battle, but the war was just starting. Tomorrow, the notary would take the stand, and tomorrow, the truth about the deed would come out. I walked toward the exit, the smell of burnt coffee finally fading, replaced by the fresh, cold air of the street. I took a deep breath. It tasted like victory, but I knew better than to celebrate yet. My parents were cornered animals now, and cornered animals bite. I needed to be ready for the next attack. I needed that security footage, and I needed to know why. Why now? Why the rush? Why the forgery? People don't commit felonies just to teach their daughter a lesson. They do it because they are desperate. I needed to find out what they were running from. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding brightness of the mid-morning sun. The air tasted different now. It no longer carried the metallic tang of fear. It tasted like cold, sharp oxygen. I didn't stop moving. I didn't let the relief settle in my bones because relief was a sedative, and I needed to stay sharp. The stay order in my bag was just a temporary shield. It was a pause button, not a victory. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number Sergeant. Miller had slipped to me. It rang once. Civil Enforcement Unit. Miller speaking. This is Kylie Perez, I said, my voice steady against the traffic noise. I have the signed order from Judge Marston staying the execution of the writ. I heard the rustle of paper on his end, then the sound of typing. I see it in the system, he said. The court clerk just uploaded the minute order. That was fast work. I didn't have a choice, I replied. He grunted. Enforcement is suspended. I have called off the deputy scheduled for the lockout. No one is touching your door today. Thank you, I said. Keep that paperwork on you, he advised, and maybe keep your doors locked anyway. A piece of paper stops the sheriff, but it doesn't stop crazy. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. It doesn't stop crazy. He was right. My parents weren't just litigious. They were desperate. And desperate people did not respect boundaries just because a judge banged a gavel. I walked to my car, but I didn't turn toward home. Not yet. I had one more stop to make before I retreated to my fortress. I keyed the ignition and merged into the traffic, heading toward the county recorder's office. The recorder's office was in a separate building, a squat concrete structure that smelled of toner and dust. It was the Library of Property History, the place where ownership was defined by timestamps and stamps. I walked in and took a ticket. The room was quiet, filled with real estate agents and paralegals scanning documents. When my number was called, I approached the counter. The clerk was a young woman with bright green fingernails that clicked against the keyboard. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I need to report a fraudulent recording," I said, sliding my ID across the counter, "and I need to place a fraud alert on my parcel number." She stopped typing. She looked at my ID, then at me. "Parcel number?" she asked. I gave it to her. She punched it in. "I see a grant deed recorded on January 15th, she said, squinting at the screen. "Transferring title from Kylie Perez to Elena and Gabriel Perez. That is the fraudulent document," I said. "I did not sign it. There is currently a court order staying an eviction based on that deed, and the notary has been subpoenaed for tomorrow morning." I slid a copy of the court order across the counter. She glanced at it, her eyebrows rising. "Okay," she said, her tone shifting from bureaucratic to conspiratorial. "I can flag the property. That means if anyone tries to record a new document, like a sale or a mortgage, you will get an immediate notification, and we will require extra verification. It basically freezes the title." "Do it," I said. She typed a series of commands. "Flag is active," she confirmed. "Do you want copies of the intake records?" "Yes," I said. "I want everything. I want the scanned image of the deed, and I want the metadata. I want to know exactly when it was scanned and who brought it in." She hit print. The laser printer behind her hummed to life, spitting out warm sheets of paper. She gathered them and stapled them in the corner. "Here is the deed image," she said, pointing to the top page. "And here is the intake sheet." I looked at the intake sheet. It was a log of the transaction. Date: January 15th, 2026. Time: 2:14 in the afternoon. Method: over-the-counter/in person. In person. They didn't mail it. They didn't hire a courier. They walked it in. "Who submitted it?" I asked. The clerk pointed to a line at the bottom. "Submitter: Gabriel Perez. My father. He had walked into this building, stood at this counter, and handed over a forgery with a smile. The audacity of it made my blood run cold. "There is something else," the clerk said. She pulled the image of the deed closer and tapped the bottom corner with a green fingernail. "Look at the notary acknowledgement." I leaned in. The stamp belonged to Sabrina Cole, but inside the handwritten commission number, there was a tiny, jagged mark. A number had been written, then crossed out, and a new number written over it. A correction. The clerk said, "It is unusual for a notary to mess up their own commission number. They write that number 10 times a day. It is like forgetting your own phone number. Unless you are nervous," I said softy, "or unless you are rushing, or unless you are not the one writing it," the clerk suggested. "Sometimes, if the stamp is blurry, people try to write the number in by hand to help the scanner. But if they get it wrong—" She let the sentence hang in the air. It was a crack in the armor, a tiny ink-stained error that screamed of human imperfection and haste. "I will take a certified copy of that, please," I said. 10 minutes later, I walked out with a thick envelope tucked under my arm. The paper was still warm. It felt heavy, not with weight, but with potential. This was armor. This was the evidence that would turn a family dispute into a felony investigation. I drove home. The streets were familiar, but they looked different now. The trees, the houses, the stop signs, everything looked sharper, defined by the clarity of survival. I pulled into my driveway. The spot across the street where my parents had stood was empty. The deputy was gone. The house stood silent, waiting for me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I didn't take off my shoes. I went straight to the kitchen, dropped the bag on the counter, and pulled out my phone. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At Northbridge Systems Group, the lunch rush would be ending. I dialed the internal security number. I knew it by heart. Northbridge Security. A male voice answered. "This is Kylie Perez, employee ID 49920. I said, "I am currently out on personal leave, but I need to request an urgent extraction of my access logs for legal purposes." "Verification code?" the guard asked. "Delta 9 X-ray Whiskey," I recited. "Go ahead." "Ms. Perez, I need the badge entry and exit logs for the main campus. Building C, for January 15th, 2026. I also need the parking garage gate logs for my vehicle tag." One moment. I heard the rapid clicking of keys. I looked out the kitchen window. The street was empty, but I felt exposed. I lowered the blinds. "Okay, I have the logs," the guard said. "On January 15th, you badged into the parking garage at 7:45 in the morning. You badged into Building C turnstiles at 7:52. You did not exit the turnstiles until 6:10 in the evening, and the notary claimed I signed a deed in her office at 12:15. Can you export that to a PDF and email it to my corporate account?" I asked. "And can you digitally sign it? I need it admissible in court." "Standard procedure," he said. "Sending it now." I hung up. I had the alibi. I had the logs. I had the flawed deed. I had the intake record placing my father at the scene of the recording. I was building a cage, bar by bar, around the people who raised me. I sat down at the island and opened my laptop. I logged into my work email and saw the notification from security. I downloaded the file and saved it to 3 different cloud drives. Then I printed 2 copies. Just as the printer finished whirring, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the heavy pound of the sheriff. It was a rapid, insistent pressing of the button. Ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong. I froze. I didn't need to look at the camera to know who it was. They had regrouped. They had realized their legal blitzkrieg had failed. So now they were switching to emotional siege. I walked to the hallway, but I didn't go to the door. I stopped 10 feet away. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. I hit the red button. "Kylie." It was my mother's voice. It was high-pitched, laced with a frantic sort of sweetness. "Kylie, open the door. We know you are in there. We saw your car." I said nothing. I watched the waveform on my phone screen jump with every word she spoke. "Kylie, please." Gabriel's voice joined in. It was deep, authoritative, the voice that used to command me to clean my room or finish my homework. "We just want to talk. There has been a misunderstanding. The lawyer. He made a mistake. We can fix this. We can explain." I stepped closer, my socks sliding on the hardwood. I could see their silhouettes through the frosted glass of the front door. Distorted. Looming shapes. "You need to open this door." "Young lady." Elena's voice dropped the sweetness. It became sharp, the voice of the disciplinarian. "We are your parents. You cannot drag us into court like criminals. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is?" I stared at the door. Embarrassing. That was their currency. Not legality, not morality, but appearance. I took a breath. I made sure my voice was loud, clear, and devoid of any tremble. "Go away." I said, "Kylie, open up." Gabriel pounded on the wood with the flat of his hand. It was a violent sound. "We are not leaving until we settle this." I held the phone up, capturing the thud of his fist against the door. "I am recording this," I stated. My voice was cold, projecting through the wood. "I have a court order that stays the eviction, and I have security logs that prove I wasn't at the notary." There was a silence on the other side. A heavy, stunned silence. They hadn't expected me to have the logs yet. They thought they were faster than me. "Honey," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was meant to be conspiratorial. "Don't be like this. We are family. Family protects each other. We were doing this for your own good. You are not thinking clearly. Just let us in, and we can tear up all those papers. We can start over." It was the bait, the same bait they had used for 20 years. "We are family." It was the phrase they used to excuse the reading of my diaries, the controlling of my bank accounts, the criticism of my choices. It was the phrase they used to demand total submission. But I wasn't 19 anymore, and I wasn't hungry for their approval. I looked at the phone in my hand. The timer read 2 minutes and 15 seconds. That is not family. I said, speaking directly to the frosted glass. That is fraud. I heard a sharp intake of breath from outside. You ungrateful? Gabriel started. But Elena shushed him. We are going, Elena said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. But this isn't over. You are making a terrible mistake. Kylie, you are going to lose everything. I heard footsteps retreating down the walk. I heard car doors slam. I heard an engine rev and fade away. I stopped the recording. I titled the file harassment_incident_1. I uploaded it to the cloud folder labeled case_evidence. I walked back to the kitchen. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear, from the adrenaline of the severance. I had finally said it. I had finally drawn the line that they could not cross. The afternoon dragged into evening. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the house in the gray twilight, checking the windows, checking the locks. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I ate a cold sandwich standing over the sink, my eyes fixed on the driveway. At 9:30 at night, my phone buzzed on the counter. It wasn't a call. It was a text message. I picked it up. The number was unknown. No caller ID, just a string of digits. I opened the message. If you show up tomorrow, you will lose more than a house. Forget it. I stared at the glowing screen. The threat was vague enough to be deniable, but specific enough to chill my blood. Lose more than a house. It implied physical harm. It implied destruction of reputation. It implied that the gloves were off. My first instinct was fear, a spike of panic that made me want to delete the message and hide under the covers. But then I remembered the clerk at the recorder's office. I remembered the correction mark on the deed. I remembered the intake log. Submitter. Gabriel Perez. They were scared. You don't send anonymous threats when you are confident in your legal case. You send threats when you know you are about to be exposed. They were trying to scare me away from the courtroom. They wanted a default judgment because they couldn't survive a trial. I didn't delete the message. I took a screenshot. Then I opened the case file on my phone and added the image. I named it Exhibit_E_threat. Patterns matter. I whispered to the empty, dark kitchen. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a small, battery-operated camera I had bought for watching my pets when I traveled. I set it up on the windowsill, pointing it directly at the front door. I went to the bedroom and pulled the dresser in front of the door. It was a primal, childish defense, but it made me feel safer. I lay down on the bed, fully dressed, the file of papers next to me on the pillow. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I replayed the plan for tomorrow, the notary, the logs, the metadata. They wanted me to stay home. They wanted me to be afraid. But fear was yesterday's emotion. Tonight, I felt something colder. I felt the mechanical precision of the law. I would show up tomorrow, and I would bring the record with me. The silence in my house that night was heavy, not empty. It was the kind of silence that felt pressurized, like the air inside a submarine dive chamber. I sat at the dining room table, the only island of light in a sea of shadows, and looked at the physical components of my defense. I had cleared the table of everything else. No coasters, no placemats, no centerpiece. There was only the wood grain and the paper. I was treating this surface like a command center, or perhaps an operating table. I needed to dissect the lie before I could kill it. I had one manila folder, just one. I didn't want a chaotic pile of loose sheets that I would have to shuffle through in front of Judge Marston. Fumbling looked like incompetence. Fumbling looked like panic. I needed to be a machine. I labeled the tab of the folder with a black permanent marker. Case evidence. I began to organize the stack, placing the documents in the exact order I intended to present them. It was a narrative construction, a story told in ink and stamps. First, the court order, the stay of execution signed by Judge Marston that morning. This was my shield. It proved I had the right to be in the room. Second, the proof of service, the lie that started it all, I used a highlighter to mark the line where Elena Perez had signed for the papers at the wrong address. Third, the forged lease. The document where they had tried to fake my signature to establish a landlord-tenant relationship. I placed it next to a copy of my real signature from my driver's license so the difference would be visually violent. Fourth, the fraudulent deed, the $10 transfer. I included the blown-up image of the notary stamp with the handwritten correction in the commission number. That tiny scratch of ink was the crack in the dam. Fifth, the recorder's intake metadata. The printout that showed Gabriel Perez had walked the deed into the office at 2:14 in the afternoon. And finally, the screenshot. The text message from the unknown number. If you show up tomorrow, you will lose more than a house. I had printed it on photo paper so the black background of the screen was glossy and dark. It looked nasty. It looked like a threat. I stacked them, squared the edges, and slipped them into the folder. But paper was fragile. Paper could be lost. Paper could be burned. Or, in my parents' world, paper could simply disappear from a table while you went to the bathroom. I opened my laptop. The blue light of the screen washed over my hands. I logged into my personal email, then my work email, then a secondary backup email I hadn't used in years. I scanned every single document again. I didn't trust the previous scans. I wanted fresh, high-resolution copies. I composed a new email to myself. Subject line: Evidence Packet A. Do not delete. I attached the files one by one. I watched the progress bars load, blue lines filling up, turning my physical armor into digital ghosts that lived on servers my parents couldn't touch. I hit send. Then I forwarded it to my best friend, to my work address, and to the cloud. Just as the sent notification popped up, my inbox chimed. From Northbridge Security Operations. Subject: Urgent. Access log request. K. Perez. My breath hitched. This was it. The alibi. I clicked the email open. It wasn't just a summary. The security chief had sent the raw data export, certified with a digital signature, that verified its authenticity for legal proceedings. It was a spreadsheet, dense with timestamps and location codes. I scrolled down to January 15th, 2026. It was beautiful. It was a wall of data that no amount of crying or gaslighting could penetrate. Line 1, 0745 hours. Vehicle tag X-ray 429, entry. Parking structure B, gate 3, line 2, 0752 hours. Badge ID 49920, entry. Turnstile North. Building C, line 3, 0810 hours. Badge ID 49920. Access. Secure lab. Door 4. I traced the day with my finger on the screen. The logs showed me moving through the building like a ghost in the machine. I went to the cafeteria at 12:30 for 15 minutes. I went back to the lab. I accessed the server room at 2 o'clock. I stopped at the 12 o'clock block. The notary, Sabrina Cole, had written in her journal that I was in her office, signing a deed. At 12:15 in the afternoon, my eyes darted back to the security log. 12:15 hours. Badge ID 49920. Internal door access. Corridor B. Corridor B was inside the secure zone. You needed a badge and a biometric thumbprint to open that door. And Corridor B was 22 miles away from the notary's office. Unless I had discovered teleportation, or unless I had a twin, the notary was lying. And she wasn't just lying. She was lying in a way that was scientifically impossible. I printed the log. I printed it twice. I felt a grim satisfaction as the warm pages settled into the tray. But then, a cold thought struck me. It was a nagging question that had been itching at the back of my brain since the moment the deputy mentioned the Oakhaven address. How did they do it? Not the forgery. I knew how they did that. But how did they get the details right? How did they know my driver's license number? How did they know the exact legal description of my property to put on the deed? How did they have a copy of my signature to trace, even if they did a bad job of it? I hadn't spoken to them in months. I had shredded my mail. I had locked down my credit. Then I remembered the garage. Not my garage. Theirs. When I moved out at 19, I had left in a hurry. I had packed 2 suitcases and fled in the middle of the night. I left behind boxes of high school yearbooks, old birthday cards, medical records from when I was a child, and tax returns. My first few tax returns from my teenage jobs. Those boxes were sitting in their garage, gathering dust, or so I had thought. They hadn't hacked a computer. They hadn't hired a private investigator. They had simply walked into their own garage, opened a cardboard box marked Kylie, and mined my past for the data they needed to destroy my future. They had my social security number from old dependency forms. They had my old signature from high school report cards. They had the Oak Haven address because it was on every piece of mail I received from age 15 to 19. It was a violation that felt more intimate than a physical blow. They had used the artifacts of my childhood, the evidence of their own parenthood, to construct a weapon against me. I closed my eyes and forced the nausea down. I couldn't dwell on the betrayal. Betrayal was an emotion, and emotions were useless tonight. I needed to be cold. I needed to be analytical. I grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and a black pen. I needed to visualize the timeline for the judge. Judges liked simple things. They liked binary choices, true or false, here or there. I drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left side, I wrote, "The truth," certified security logs. On the right side, I wrote, "The lie," fraudulent deed notary journal. I started filling in the hours. 12 noon. Left side, Kylie Perez is inside Northbridge Building C, video/badge verified. Right side, Kylie Perez is allegedly driving to notary office. 12:15. Left side, Kylie Perez uses thumbprint to open corridor B door. Right side, notary claims Kylie Perez is standing in front of her desk signing a deed. 2:14. Left side, Kylie Perez is logged into workstation. Terminal 4. Right side, Gabriel Perez is physically recording the deed at County Recorder's office. I looked at the comparison. It was impossible to reconcile. The two realities could not coexist. One was supported by automated, impartial machinery. The other was supported by the word of 3 people who had a financial interest in the outcome. I printed this timeline too. It wasn't official evidence, but it was a demonstrative aid. It was a map for the judge to follow. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 11:45 at night. I had 2 full sets of everything, one for the court, one for me. I placed the backup set in my fireproof pouch and hid it inside the vent in the laundry room. It was paranoid, yes, but after today, paranoia felt like common sense. I took the primary folder and placed it by the front door, next to my keys and my bag. Then I stood in the hallway and looked at the house. My house. For the last 12 hours, I had been operating on a fuel mixture of adrenaline and rage. I had been reacting to Mom and Dad. I had been fighting the ghosts of my childhood. But as I looked at the neatly labeled folder, something shifted in my mind. If I walked into that courtroom tomorrow as a hurt daughter, I would lose. If I cried when my mother played the victim, I would look unstable. If I screamed when my father lied, I would look aggressive. I couldn't be their daughter tomorrow. I had to be a stranger. I repeated the mantra I had started earlier, but I refined it. I stripped the names out of it. The plaintiff filed a false instrument. The plaintiff committed perjury. The plaintiff attempted grand theft. They weren't my parents. They were the opposing counsel's clients. They were defendants in a future criminal case. They were biological donors who had breached a contract. I turned off the kitchen light. The darkness rushed in. But I didn't feel the fear I had felt earlier. I checked the camera I had set up on the windowsill. The little red light was blinking steady and sure. It was watching the door so I didn't have to. I went to my bedroom. The dresser was still pushed against the door. I left it there. I climbed onto the bed, fully dressed in comfortable clothes, leggings and a sweatshirt, ready to move if I had to. I wasn't tired. My brain was still spinning, rehearsing cross-examination questions I wouldn't be allowed to ask. imagining the look on the notary's face when the logs came out, but I forced myself to close my eyes. Sleep. I commanded myself, you need to be sharper than them. Exhaustion was a vulnerability. If I went into court with gritty eyes and a foggy brain, I might miss a detail. I might miss a whisper between the lawyer and my father. I might miss a signal from the judge. I breathed in for a count of 4. I held it for 7. I exhaled for 8. I visualized the security logs, row after row of data. I visualized the timestamp, 12:15. I visualized the judge's face. I didn't dream of my parents. I didn't dream of the childhood house on Oak Haven Drive. I dreamed of paper. Reams and reams of white paper, stacking up like bricks, building a wall that no one could climb over. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to turn the sky gray. It was 5:30 in the morning. I didn't jolt awake this time. I woke up instantly, my eyes snapping open with a cold, hard clarity. The panic of yesterday morning was gone. The emotional turbulence of the afternoon was gone. I felt hollowed out, but in a good way, like a weapon that had been stripped, cleaned, and reassembled. I got up and moved the dresser away from the door. I showered. I didn't put on the soft, approachable clothes I usually wore. I put on a black blazer. I put on a white button-down shirt. I put on trousers that were crisp and professional. I pulled my hair back into a tight, low bun. No loose strands, no chaos. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back didn't look like a victim. She looked like an auditor. She looked like someone who had come to check the books and found a discrepancy. I walked to the kitchen and drank a glass of water. I didn't eat. My stomach was a knot of tension, but it was a controlled tension. I picked up the folder. Case evidence. It felt heavy in my hand. It was the weight of the truth. I checked the camera one last time. Nothing on the recording. They hadn't come back. They were probably huddled with Caleb Hart, trying to figure out how to spin the story. They were probably rehearsing their tears. Let them cry. I opened the front door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The world was quiet. The street was empty. I locked the door. I got into my car. I didn't look back at the house. I looked forward, toward the courthouse. I wasn't going there to argue with my family. I was going there to correct the record. And the record was the only thing that lasted. The air in Department 4 was different this morning. Yesterday, it had been stale with the smell of routine bureaucracy. Today, it felt pressurized, like the inside of a glass jar just before it shatters. I walked through the double doors at exactly 8:55 in the morning. I didn't look at the gallery. I didn't look at the clerk. My eyes went straight to the row of seats behind the plaintiff's table. She was there, Sabrina Cole, the notary public. She didn't look like a conspirator in a grand fraud. She looked like a woman who was regretting every life choice that had led her to this room. She was wearing a floral blouse that was too cheerful for the occasion, and she was clutching a beige purse against her chest like it was a lifeboat in a storm. Her eyes were darting around the room, landing on the bailiff, the flag, the judge's empty chair, but never settling on anything. My parents sat in front of her. They were rigid, their posture defensive. Elena wasn't wearing the sad grandmother cardigan today. She was wearing a stiff black suit, as if she were attending a funeral, which, in a way, she was. She was attending the funeral of her credibility. I walked to the defendant's table and set my folder down. Case evidence. The bold black marker looked stark against the polished wood. Caleb Hart, their attorney, was already organizing his papers. He looked tired. The shine on his suit seemed a little duller than yesterday. He knew he was walking into a minefield, but I don't think he realized just how many mines I had planted. All rise, the bailiff announced. Judge Marston took the bench. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She didn't ask how everyone was doing. She sat down, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked directly at the notary. Ms. Cole, the judge said, her voice cutting through the room. Please step forward and take the stand. Sabrina Cole stood up. Her purse slipped from her lap and hit the floor with a soft thud. She scrambled to pick it up, her face flushing a deep, blotchy red. She walked to the witness box, her heels clicking an erratic rhythm on the floor. She swore the oath in a voice so quiet, the court reporter had to ask her to repeat it. Judge Marston turned to Caleb Hart. "Counsel, do you have the original grant deed and the notary journal as ordered?" Hart stood up. "Yes, Your Honor." He walked to the witness box and handed a thick, leather-bound book and a single sheet of paper to the clerk, who then handed them up to the judge. Marston opened the journal. She ran her hand over the page, flattening it. The sound of the paper crinkling was the only noise in the room. "Ms. Cole," the judge began, her tone deceptively conversational. "You are a commissioned notary public in the state of California, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sabrina whispered. "And you understand that a notary's journal is a public record? That it is the official log of your acts as an officer of the state?" "Yes." The judge looked down at the book. "Turn to the entry for January 15th, 2026, the judge commanded. Sabrina reached for the book, her hands trembling. She flipped the pages. "I have it," she said. "Read the entry for the quitclaim deed involving the property on Elm Street," the judge said. Sabrina cleared her throat. "Date, January 15th. Time, 12:15 in the afternoon. Document type, quitclaim deed. Signer, Kylie Perez." The judge leaned back in her chair. "And according to this entry, you verified the signer's identity, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "How?" I checked her driver's license," Sabrina said. She glanced at the back of my parents' heads, looking for a lifeline. But they were staring straight forward. Statues of denial. Judge Marston looked at the journal entry again, read the driver's license number you recorded in this column. The judge said, Sabrina squinted at her own handwriting. "It is DL 649-21008. The judge wrote the number down on her legal pad. Then she looked up and locked eyes with me. "Ms. Perez, please stand." I stood up. My legs felt solid. My heartbeat was slow, steady. "State your driver's license number for the record," the judge ordered. I didn't need to look at my wallet. I knew it. California driver's license number, DL 649-210-995. The room went silent. The judge looked at the number she had written down. Then she looked at the journal. 008. The judge repeated. "And Ms. Perez says 995. She looked at Sabrina. "Ms. Cole, that is not a small error. That is not transposing 2 digits. That is a completely different ending sequence. Did you have the physical card in your hand?" Sabrina swallowed hard. I thought I did. Maybe I wrote it down wrong. It was busy that day. I might have been looking at the wrong line." "The wrong line," the judge echoed. She didn't buy it. She flipped the page of the journal back and forth. "There are no other entries for that hour. You weren't busy." Hart stood up. "Your Honor, a clerical error in a journal does not invalidate the signature itself. If the notary testifies that the individual was present—" "Sit down. Mr. Hart," the judge snapped. "I am not done." She turned the journal around so it faced the courtroom. She pointed to a scrawl in the signature box. "Ms. Cole, look at this signature." Sabrina looked. "Now look at the verification of the complaint filed by the defendant yesterday," the judge said. Holding up my affidavit, she placed the 2 signatures side by side. One was my actual signature, sharp, angular, rapid. The other, the one in the journal, was a loopy, hesitant cursive that looked like a child practicing their penmanship. "These do not match," the judge stated flatly. "They are not even close. One is written with a heavy hand, the other is light. The slant is different." She looked at Sabrina, her eyes narrowing. "Ms. Cole, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully about your answer because perjury is a felony." Sabrina gripped the edge of the witness stand. Her knuckles were white. "Did Kylie Perez, the woman standing right there in the blazer, sign this book in your presence?" Sabrina looked at me. For the first time, she really looked at me. She saw the coldness in my face. She saw that I wasn't going to help her. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. She was there. She signed it. The lie hung in the air. Toxic and desperate. Judge Marston sighed. It was a sound of disappointment. Ms. Perez, the judge said to me, you mentioned yesterday that you have evidence regarding your whereabouts. I do. Your Honor. I said. I opened my folder. I pulled out the certified security logs from Northbridge Systems Group. I handed the copies to the bailiff, who walked them to the bench. This is a certified access log from my employer, Northbridge Systems Group, I explained, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. It is digitally signed by the Chief of Security. The judge put on her glasses again. She scanned the document. Walk me through this. Ms. Perez, on January 15th, I said, pointing to the highlighted rows on my copy. I entered the secure parking structure at 7:45 in the morning. I badged into the main building at 7:52. I paused, and at 12:15 in the afternoon, the exact minute Ms. Cole claims I was in her office, I used my badge and my biometric thumbprint to open a secure door in Corridor B of the research facility. The judge looked at the log. She looked at the timestamp, 12:15. She looked at the notary journal, 12:15. Northbridge Systems Group is located in the Tech District, correct? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. And Ms. Cole's office is in the valley? Yes, Your Honor. That is a 20-mile drive, the judge calculated. She looked at Sabrina Cole. The look wasn't angry anymore. It was lethal. It was the look of a predator who has cornered its prey and is deciding where to bite. Ms. Cole, the judge said softly, unless the defendant has the ability to be in two places at once, or unless she can teleport 20 miles in 0 seconds, one of these documents is a lie. Sabrina started to hyperventilate. Her chest was heaving. Maybe my clock was wrong. She stammered. Maybe she came in earlier, or later. I don't always look at the clock right when they sign. The judge slammed her hand down on the journal. The sound made everyone jump. No, the judge barked. Do not insult my intelligence. You wrote 12:15. You wrote it in ink. You are a notary public. Your entire job, your only job, is precision. If you are telling me now that your timestamps are guesses, then you are admitting to negligence. But this isn't negligence, is it? She leaned over the bench, her black robe bunching around her shoulders. This is a secured facility log. Ms. Cole, it uses atomic time. It scans fingerprints. It doesn't guess. The judge held up the log. Kylie Perez was at work. She was behind a locked door. She was not in your office. Sabrina began to cry. It wasn't a silent cry. It was a jagged, ugly sobbing that echoed in the high ceilings of the courtroom. Hart stood up again. Your Honor, I must advise the witness of her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. You are not her lawyer. Mr. Hart, the judge shouted, you represent the plaintiffs, and right now, your plaintiffs are looking at a very serious situation. She turned back to Sabrina. Ms. Cole, I am going to give you one chance, just one. If you lie to me again, I will have the bailiff take you into custody right now for perjury and filing a false instrument. The judge lowered her voice. It became quiet, intimate, and terrifying. Did you witness Kylie Perez sign this deed? Sabrina looked at the parents. Elena was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Gabriel was studying his fingernails. They had abandoned her. They had used her, pressured her, and now they were letting her drown. Sabrina saw it. She saw she was alone. No, she sobbed. The word was small, broken. The courtroom let out a collective breath. Speak up, the judge commanded. No, Sabrina wailed. She wasn't there. I never saw her. Why? The judge demanded. Why did you stamp it? They told me to. Sabrina pointed a shaking finger at my parents. Elena flinched as if she had been slapped. Who told you? Mrs. Perez, Sabrina cried out, the words tumbling out of her like water from a broken dam. She came in with her husband. They had the papers. They said Kylie was sick. They said she was having a breakdown and couldn't leave the house. They said they were trying to save her assets before she gambled them away or something. Sabrina wiped her nose with the back of her hand. They promised me it was okay. She continued. They said Kylie knew about it. They said she had signed it at home but was too medicated to come in. They begged me. Mrs. Perez was crying. She said if I didn't help them, their daughter would end up on the street. I watched my mother. She wasn't crying now. Her face was a mask of stone. She was staring straight ahead. Her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle feathering in her cheek. "And the ID number?" the judge asked. "Where did you get that?" "Gabriel gave it to me," Sabrina said. "He had a piece of paper. He read it off to me. I just wrote what he said. I wanted to help them. They seemed like such nice people. They seemed so worried about their daughter." She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know they were stealing it. I thought I was helping a family in crisis." The judge sat back. She looked exhausted. She looked at the journal, then at the deed, then at the parents. "So," the judge said, her voice flat. There was no signer. There was no ID check. There was just a story about a sick daughter and a notary who decided to bypass the law to do a favor. She looked at Caleb Hart. "Mr. Hart, do you have any cross-examination? Or would you like to save your breath?" Hart stood up slowly. He looked at his clients. He looked at the judge. He looked at the ruin of his case lying on the floor. "No questions. Your Honor." The judge turned to the bailiff. "Take charge of the journal," she ordered. "It is now evidence in a criminal matter." She looked at Sabrina. "Ms. Cole, you are excused from the stand, but you are not to leave the building. You will wait in the hallway until the deputies come to speak with you. Your commission is suspended effective immediately." Sabrina stumbled down from the stand. She didn't look at my parents as she passed them. She grabbed her purse and ran out of the courtroom, the heavy doors swallowing her sobbing. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the silence of a truth so absolute that it sucked the air out of the room. My parents didn't move. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at me. They sat frozen in the wreckage of their own lies. I stood at the defendant's table, my hand resting on the folder. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't joy. It was the cold, hard satisfaction of a math problem finally solved. The variables had been isolated. The equation had been balanced. The judge turned her gaze to the plaintiff's table. "Elena and Gabriel Perez." She said, "Stand up." They stood. They moved slowly, like people moving underwater. "I am vacating the default judgment," the judge said. "It is void ab initio. It is built on fraud." She picked up the deed. "And this deed? It is a nullity. I am ordering it stricken from the county record." She leaned forward. "But we are not done, because what I just heard from that witness stand is not a civil dispute. It is a conspiracy. It is forgery. It is filing a false instrument. And it is grand theft of real property." She looked at me. "Ms. Perez, you have your home back. The eviction is dismissed with prejudice." "Thank you, Your Honor." I said, "But," the judge continued, looking back at my parents, "I am referring this transcript and all exhibits to the district attorney's office for immediate review." Elena gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary sound. "Mr. Hart," the judge said, "you might want to advise your clients that they are going to need criminal defense counsel, because from where I'm sitting, they aren't going to be worrying about an eviction anymore. They are going to be worrying about an indictment." She banged the gavel. It sounded like a gunshot ending the war. "Court is adjourned." I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply closed my folder. I zipped up my bag. I turned to look at my parents one last time. Elena was looking at me now. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of shock and terror. She looked small. She looked old. The power she had held over me for 29 years, the power of guilt, of obligation, of fear, had evaporated. It wasn't in the room anymore. Gabriel was staring at the judge, his face pale. He knew what district attorney meant. He knew what indictment meant. I walked past them. I didn't stop to gloat. I didn't stop to say, "I told you so." I didn't have to. The record had spoken for me. I walked out of the courtroom, past the crying notary in the hallway, and into the lobby. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the sunshine. I took a deep breath. It was over. The lie was dead. But as I walked to my car, I knew that while the legal battle was finished, the aftermath was just beginning. You don't send your parents to prison without consequences. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from the unknown number again. "You think you won? Watch your back." I stared at the screen. They were still trying. Even now, with the noose tightening, they were still trying to scare me. I took a screenshot. I added it to the folder. Let them try. I thought, I have plenty of storage space for more evidence. The courtroom did not explode into chaos when the notary fled. It did not erupt into the dramatic murmurs you see in movies. Instead, the room went silent in a way that felt physical, as if the gravity had suddenly shifted on its axis. The air, which had been thick with the frantic energy of an exposed lie, settled into a heavy, suffocating stillness. It was the silence of consequences snapping into place. I stood at the defendant's table, my hands resting on the cool wood. My heart was no longer hammering against my ribs. It was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed in my ears, across the aisle, at the plaintiff's table. The atmosphere had turned freezing. Caleb Hart, the attorney who had walked in with such polished arrogance, was now staring at the empty witness stand as if he had seen a ghost. His clients, my parents, were frozen statues, their eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for the axe to fall. Judge Marston didn't look at them. She was writing. The scratching of her pen against the legal pad was the only sound in the cavernous room. It went on for a long time. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Half a minute. She was building the record. She was carving the truth into the history of the state of California. Finally, she set the pen down. She didn't look tired anymore. She looked like iron. "For the record," she began, her voice projecting to the back of the room without the aid of a microphone. "Let the minutes reflect that the witness, Sabrina Cole, has admitted under oath to notarizing the grant deed in the absence of the grantor and at the direction of the plaintiffs." She looked up, her gaze locking onto Caleb Hart. "Mr. Hart," she said. Her voice was deceptively calm. Hart stood up. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. He looked like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship who had just realized there were no lifeboats. "Yes, Your Honor," he croaked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Yes, Your Honor, the court is making the following orders effective immediately," the judge announced. She picked up the file that contained the lie of my eviction, and held it up. First, regarding the default judgment entered on January 28th against the defendant. Kylie Perez, that judgment is hereby vacated. It is void. It is a nullity. The court finds that the entry of default was obtained through extrinsic fraud, specifically the falsification of the proof of service. She dropped the file back onto the bench. Thud. Second, the writ of possession issued yesterday is dissolved. There is no eviction. There is no noon deadline. There is no lockout. The sheriff is ordered to return the writ to this court satisfied. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The noon deadline, the invisible timer that had been ticking down since 6 o'clock this morning, was gone. The threat was vaporized. Third, the judge continued. The underlying unlawful detainer complaint is dismissed with prejudice. Dismissed with prejudice. The legal term for "do not come back." It meant they couldn't fix the paperwork and try again next week. It meant this case was dead, buried, and paved over. The court finds that the plaintiffs lack standing to sue for possession because the title to the property is in dispute and appears based on the testimony heard today to be grounded in a forged instrument. Hart was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He was doing the mental calculus of his own liability. He had signed the complaint. He had filed the papers. Even if he didn't know it was a lie at the start, he was standing next to the liars now. "Your Honor," Hart stammered, trying to create distance. I would like to state for the record that counsel was unaware of the irregularities regarding the notarization My office relied on the facial validity of the recorded deed. Judge Marston looked at him over her glasses. It was a look of withering pity. "Mr. Hart, you are an officer of the court," she said. "You filed an eviction based on a deed that transferred a $500,000 property for $10, recorded 2 weeks ago, against a defendant your clients claimed was unstable, but who works for a defense contractor." She leaned forward. "Did you verify anything? Did you ask a single question? Or did you just cash the retainer check?" Hart opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He closed it again. He looked down at his shoes. He was humiliated. He was done. The judge turned her attention to the deed itself. "The clerk is ordered to impound the original grant deed and the notary journal as court exhibits 1 and 2, she ordered. "They are not to be released to any party." She paused, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Furthermore, the court is referring this entire matter, the transcript of today's hearing, the impounded exhibits, and the security logs provided by the defendant, to the district attorney's office for the investigation of fraudulent conveyance, filing a false instrument, and conspiracy to commit grand theft." My mother let out a small, strangled sound. It wasn't a sob. It was the sound of air escaping a punctured lung. "Elena Perez," the judge said, shifting her gaze to my parents. My mother didn't stand up. She couldn't. She just stared at the judge with wide, terrified eyes. "And Gabriel Perez," the judge added. My father looked at the wall, his jaw clenched, a vein pulsing in his temple. "You came into my courtroom," the judge said, her voice low and lethal. "You used the power of this court, the power of the state, to try to throw your daughter out of her own home. You lied on sworn affidavits. You corrupted a public notary. You treated the law like a weapon you could point at anyone you wanted to control." She shook her head slowly. "The weapon has turned around," she said. She turned back to me. Her face softened. "Just a fraction. Ms. Perez, yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice was steady, grounded in the reality of the win. "Do not leave this building without going to the clerk's office downstairs," she instructed. "I want you to obtain 3 certified copies of this minute order. Do not wait for the mail. Get them today. Right now. I understand." I said, "Take 1 copy to the sheriff's civil unit to ensure their system is updated immediately." She continued, listing the steps like a general giving marching orders. "Take the 2nd copy to the county recorder's office. Record it against your parcel number. It will serve as a lis pendens, a notice of pending action, that effectively freezes the title. It will prevent your parents, or anyone else, from trying to sell or borrow against that house while the criminal investigation is pending." She paused. "And the 3rd copy? Keep it in your hand." She looked at my parents again. "I am issuing a permanent restraining order protecting the property address." She stated, "If the plaintiffs, or any agents acting on their behalf, set foot on the property at 778 Elm Street, or attempt to change the locks, or attempt to shut off utilities, it will be an immediate violation of a court order." She leaned over the bench, her eyes drilling into Gabriel. "That means, Mr. Perez, that if you drive down her street, the police will arrest you. If you send a locksmith, the police will arrest you. If you so much as text her about the house, the police will arrest you. Do we understand each other?" Gabriel nodded stiffly. One jerk of his head. "I didn't hear you." The judge said, "Yes," Gabriel rasped. Elena nodded too, tears finally streaming down her face, ruining her makeup, ruining the facade. "This matter is adjourned," Judge Marston declared. She banged the gavel. The sound was final. It was the sound of a heavy door slamming shut on a long, dark room. The bailiff moved to open the side door for the judge. She swept out of the room, her black robe trailing behind her. The energy in the courtroom dissipated instantly. The tension broke, leaving behind a messy, awkward reality. I turned to pack my bag. I moved slowly, deliberately. I put the folder labeled "Case Evidence" back into my tote. I zipped it up. I could feel them behind me. I could hear Caleb Hart snapping his briefcase shut. his movements angry and rushed. "You did not tell me." I heard him hiss at my father. "You swore to me the deed was solid. You told me she signed it." "Keep your voice down," my father snapped back. But there was no power in it. It was the defensive snap of a cornered animal. "I am withdrawing," Hart said, his voice rising despite the warning. "I am filing a motion to be relieved as counsel immediately, and do not expect a refund. You people just cost me my reputation." I didn't turn around to watch them argue. I didn't care. They were cannibals. Let them eat each other. I walked toward the aisle. To get to the exit, I had to pass their table. I walked with my head up. I didn't look at the floor. I looked straight ahead at the double doors that led to freedom. As I passed them, the silence bubble around us seemed to isolate the three of us from the rest of the room. Elena was sitting in the chair, her hands covering her face. She looked small. She looked like the elderly woman she was terrified of becoming. When she heard my footsteps, she lowered her hands. Her eyes met mine. I expected anger. I expected the hiss of "ungrateful daughter" or the manipulation of "how could you," but there was nothing. The performance was gone. The scripts were burned. There was only fear, pure, unadulterated fear. She looked at me and she saw the district attorney. She saw the police. She saw the consequences she had spent a lifetime avoiding. She flinched, actually flinched, pulling her shoulder back as if she thought I might strike her. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't say a word. Gabriel didn't look at me at all. He was staring at the empty witness stand, perhaps replaying the moment the notary cracked, realizing that was the moment his life changed forever. I pushed through the swinging gate of the bar. I walked down the center aisle. The heavy oak doors were waiting. I pushed them open and stepped into the hallway. The air out here was cooler, smelling of floor wax and old coffee. I walked straight to the elevator, pressed the button for the first floor, and waited. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. It was over. The house was mine. The locks were mine. The life was mine. The elevator dinged. I stepped in. I went down to the first floor. To the clerk's window. I waited in line. I paid the fee. I watched the clerk stamp the purple certified copy seal on 3 sets of the minute order. Dismissed with prejudice. Judgment vacated. Referred to district attorney. The words were beautiful. They were poetry. I took the papers. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding noon sun. It was exactly 12 o'clock. The time the deputy was supposed to be drilling my locks. Instead, I was standing on the courthouse steps, holding the order that banned my parents from my street. I walked to my car. I got in and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, just breathing. The silence in the car was safe. It was my silence. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I stared at it. Another text. My stomach tightened. Was it another threat? Was it a plea? I picked it up. It was the unknown number again, the burner phone. Or maybe just a number I hadn't identified yet. I opened the message. There were just 2 words. Forget it. I stared at the screen. Forget it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't, "I'm sorry." It wasn't, "We love you." It was a command, a dismissal. It was them trying to sweep the wreckage under the rug one last time. Forget it. Forget we tried to ruin you. Forget we committed felonies. Forget we are monsters. Just let it go, like we always do. It was the most terrifying text they could have sent, because it showed they still didn't get it. They thought this was just another family squabble that could be silenced with denial. But you can't say forget it to a court order. You can't say forget it to a district attorney investigation. I didn't delete the text. I took a screenshot. I opened my folder app. I saved it right next to the threat from last night. Patterns matter. I put the phone down and put the car in gear. I had to go to the recorder's office. I had to go to the sheriff's station. I had work to do. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the courthouse behind me, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of the text message. Forget it was what they wanted me to do, but I was going to remember. I was going to remember every single detail, and I was going to make sure the record remembered too. The drive from the courthouse to the county recorder's office was short. but it felt like crossing a border between two different countries. I had left the country of fear and entered the country of absolute documented fact. I parked my car in the same spot I had used the day before, but the woman stepping onto the asphalt was not the same woman who had rushed in here begging for a fraud alert. That woman had been desperate. I was simply efficient. I walked up to the counter, the 3 certified copies of the court order warm in my hand. The same clerk with the green fingernails was there. She looked up, and recognition flashed in her eyes. She saw the certified stamp on the paperwork, the purple ink that signaled the authority of the Superior Court. "You got it," she said. It wasn't a question. I got it. I confirmed. "I need to record this immediately. I want it cross-referenced against the parcel number, the grant deed, and the fraud alert. I want it to be the first thing anyone sees when they pull this property title." She took the papers. She worked quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The scanner hummed, digesting the judge's order and turning it into a permanent digital shield. "This acts as a lis pendens," she narrated as she worked. "Notice of pending action. It effectively freezes the title. If anyone tries to transfer it, sell it, or borrow against it, this pops up and stops the transaction dead." "That is exactly what I want," I said. She hit a final key, and the printer churned out a receipt. She handed it to me, but she didn't let go of the paper immediately. She held on to the corner, leaning in closer over the counter. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a murmur, "it is a good thing you came in yesterday with that fraud alert, and it is a good thing you brought this today." "Why?" I asked. A cold prickle of instinct ran down my spine. "Because," she said, glancing at her screen, "we had a title company inquiry on this parcel this morning. At 8 o'clock, my stomach turned over. 8 o'clock this morning, that was 1 hour before the hearing started. That was while I was sitting in the hallway waiting for the doors to open." "Who was inquiring?" I asked. She turned her screen slightly so I could see. It was a title search request initiated by a company called Quick Close Holdings, LLC. They were rushing a preliminary title report. I stared at the name, Quick Close Holdings. It sounded like a cash for homes operation. The kind of predatory company that bought properties below market value for fast cash. No questions asked. "Can you see why they were inquiring?" I asked. The clerk tapped a few keys. "It looks like there was an escrow opened," she said. "A cash sale. Closing date was scheduled for this Friday." I felt the air leave my lungs. Friday, 2 days from now. They weren't just stealing the house to control me. They weren't just trying to put me in a facility or protect the family assets. They had sold it. They had forged the deed on January 15th. They had recorded it that same afternoon. They had served the eviction lawsuit to get me out by today, Wednesday, and they had a buyer lined up to close on Friday. If I hadn't answered the door, if I had packed my bags and left, if I hadn't fought, they would have kicked me out at noon today. They would have changed the locks. And on Friday, they would have signed the final closing papers and walked away with a cashier's check for the entire equity of my home. "How much?" I whispered. "Do you see a price?" The clerk shook her head. "The price isn't listed on the inquiry, just the transfer tax estimate. But based on the tax," she did a quick mental calculation, "they were dumping it for about 60% of its market value. Fire sale. They were selling my life for parts to the first bidder who showed up with a check." "Thank you," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. I took my receipt and walked out. The puzzle was complete now. The why finally made sense. My parents weren't evil masterminds playing a game of psychological chess. They were just broke. They were desperate debtors trying to liquidate the only asset they could reach. Mine. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel. I thought about the family dinners where they asked about my job. I thought about the times they asked if I had paid off the mortgage yet. They weren't making conversation. They were appraising the inventory. The motive wasn't love. It wasn't even hate. It was just math. They had a debt. Maybe gambling. Maybe a bad investment. Maybe a loan shark. And I was the savings account they decided to raid. I pulled out my phone. I had one more stop to make before I went home. But first, I needed to make sure the shield was fully deployed. I called the number for the sheriff's civil unit. "Sergeant Miller," the voice answered. "It is Kylie Perez." I said, "I have the certified dismissal. I am heading to your office now to drop off the copy. But I wanted you to know that the title is locked. And Sergeant, yeah? If anyone calls you claiming to be the new owner, or a buyer, or a title company—" "I know." He interrupted. "I already got a call from a Caleb Hart." He sounded like he was trying to distance himself from a bomb. "He told us to cancel everything and said he is no longer representing the plaintiffs. You are in the clear, Ms. Perez." I drove to the station and dropped off the paperwork. Then I drove to the local police precinct. I walked up to the front desk and asked for the form to file a restraining order. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel guilty. I filled out the paperwork with the same cold precision I had used on the affidavits. Basis for request: attempted illegal eviction, filing of false instruments, conspiracy to commit grand theft, and anonymous threats of physical harm. I attached the screenshot of the text message. "If you show up tomorrow, you will lose more than a house." I attached the screenshot of the second text. Forget it. I attached a copy of the judge's minute order, highlighting the section where she warned them that any contact would result in arrest. The officer at the desk looked over the file. He whistled low between his teeth when he saw the judge's comments. "You don't usually see a civil judge get this angry in the minutes," he commented. "They made a bad impression," I said. He stamped the forms. "We will get this served," he said. "Given the judge's order this morning, this is basically a formality. If they show up on your street, call 911. We will pick them up." I walked out of the station. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It was late afternoon. The day that was supposed to be my eviction day was ending. I drove home. When I turned onto Elm Street, I slowed down. I scanned the sidewalks. I scanned the parked cars. No parents, no spectators, no deputy. My house stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It looked solid. It looked immovable. I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. I didn't go inside immediately. I walked to the trunk of my car and pulled out a box I had bought on the way home. New locks, high security, heavy-duty deadbolts. I spent the next 2 hours with a screwdriver and a drill. I removed the old locks, the ones my parents might have had a key to, the ones they might have copied years ago just in case. I replaced them with expensive, complex mechanisms that felt heavy in my hand. I installed a camera above the front door, screwing it into the wood frame. I installed another one looking at the driveway. I linked them to my phone. It wasn't paranoia. It was infrastructure. When the last screw was tightened, I went inside and locked the door. The sound of the new deadbolt sliding home was different. It was deeper, louder. It sounded like a bank vault closing. I walked through the house, turning on lights. I went into the office and opened the safe. I placed the certified copies of the court orders inside. I placed the flash drive with the security logs inside. Then, I reached for a box at the back of the safe. It was an old metal document box that had belonged to my great-aunt Lucia. She was the one relative who had always looked at my parents with a skeptical eye, the one who had whispered to me to keep my money separate, to keep my business private. She had died 5 years ago, leaving me her small estate and her papers. I hadn't opened this box in years, but something about today, something about the phrase "let the records speak," triggered a memory. I opened the lid. It smelled of lavender and old paper. Inside were her birth certificate, her marriage license, and a stack of savings bonds. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope. It wasn't addressed to me. It was just labeled, "For the one who needs it." I picked it up. The paper was brittle. I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, covered in Lucia's sprawling, elegant handwriting. To my blood, it read, "The world will try to tell you that family is everything. They will tell you that blood is thicker than water. But blood can be toxic, and water can wash you clean. I don't know who is reading this, or what they did to you, but I know our family. I know how they covet what isn't theirs. I know how they smile while they pick your pocket. If the day comes when they try to take what you have built, do not argue with them. Do not cry to them. They do not hear tears. They only hear weakness. If they try to take it, let the record speak. Paper does not lie. Paper does not forget. Trap them in the truth, and then lock the door. You are your own ancestor now. Build your own house. Love, Lucia. I lowered the letter. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the chill of recognition. She had known. She had seen the greed in my parents long before I was old enough to understand it. She had left this message like a time capsule, waiting for the moment I would be ready to hear it. You are your own ancestor now. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, right on top of the court order dismissing the eviction. They belonged together. One was the prophecy, the other was the fulfillment. I stood up and walked into the living room. The sun was setting now, casting long rectangles of orange light across the hardwood floor. Dust motes danced in the beams, swirling in the quiet air. I stood in the center of the room and listened. I didn't hear the pounding of the sheriff. I didn't hear the screaming of my mother. I didn't hear the manipulative whispers of my father. I heard the refrigerator humming. I heard the distant sound of a car passing on the street. I heard my own breathing. The investigation was just starting. Sergeant, Miller had told me that the district attorney was already pulling the notary's records for the last 5 years. They suspected she was part of a ring, and my parents were just the latest customers. My parents would be facing interviews, subpoenas, and likely indictments. The easy money they had counted on for Friday had turned into a criminal defense bill that would bankrupt them. They had tried to erase me with paperwork. They had tried to overwrite my ownership with a forgery. But they forgot that I was a writer. I knew how to edit. I knew how to draft. And most importantly, I knew how to publish. I had rewritten their ending. I looked at the walls of my house. They weren't just drywall and paint anymore. They were a testament. Every square inch was mine. Not just because I paid for it, but because I had fought for it in open court and won. This wasn't just triumph. Triumph is fleeting. Triumph is the spike of adrenaline when the judge bangs the gavel. This was something better. This was quiet. This was permanent. This was ownership that could not be argued with. I walked to the window and looked out at the street one last time. It was empty. The threat was gone. I let the blinds snap shut. I turned back to the empty room, to the silence that was finally, truly mine. If your own parents tried to erase you with paperwork, if they tried to steal your safe harbor and call it love, would you confront them? Would you scream and cry and beg them to remember that you are their child? Or would you do what I did? Would you stop being a victim, start being a witness, and trap them in the record? Thank you so much for listening to this story. It was a long journey from that knock on the door to the final gavel, and I really appreciate you staying with me until the very end. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Are you listening from the United States? From the UK? From Vietnam? Or somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment down below and let me know your location and what you would have done if you were in Kylie's shoes. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more revenge dramas about justice being served, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Jane Revenge Stories. Don't forget to like this video and smash that hype button. It really helps these stories get recommended to more people who might need to hear them. Thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next story.